Today, we're diving deep into the PURR Act, a piece of proposed legislation that aims to, quote-unquote, unify the pet food regulatory landscape, but, when examined more closely, could actually put the integrity of your pet's food into jeopardy. But first, let's take a step back. It's estimated that 33 million Americans are allergic to at least one food or ingredient. Even if you don't have a food allergy, you know someone who does. And you'll also know that people with many food allergies, or those that could have severe reactions, are very careful about how they shop for food. People who are allergic to certain food ingredients will also tell you this is not out of paranoia or for the sake of being high maintenance, but out of necessity. Because when a mishap occurs, the consequences can be serious and sometimes life-threatening.
Now imagine a world where food companies no longer have to be completely transparent about ingredients, where vague and misleading claims go unchecked, and where there's no system in place to verify if the exact ingredient listed on the label is what's actually in the box.
That's exactly the kind of regulatory loophole the PURR Act could create in the pet food industry. Right now, state regulators play a crucial role in ensuring that pet food labels are truthful and that ingredient substitutions don't put pets' health at risk. But if the PURR Act passes, much of that oversight could disappear, potentially opening the door for bad actors, misleading claims, and unverified ingredients to make their way into your dog and cat's food.
So we're here today asking the big questions. How will this impact pet food safety? Who will hold brands accountable? And what can pet owners do to protect their pets? To help us break it all down, we're joined by two industry experts who know exactly what's at stake. Let's get into it. Welcome to Barking Mad, a podcast by BSM Partners. We're your hosts, Dr. Stephanie Clark.
And I'm Jordan Tyler. So at first glance, the PURR Act might seem like a step toward consistency in pet food oversight, streamlining regulations, reducing some red tape, and creating a more uniform system. But as we start to peel back the layers, a more complicated reality emerges. Dig a little deeper and you'll find this bill would strip regulatory power from state agencies and consolidate it under the FDA, raising concerns about enforcement capacity, consumer protections, and even the future of innovation in pet food.
So what would this mean for pet food companies, big and small? Would it make it easier to bring new products to market? Or would it open the door for misleading claims and unregulated ingredients? And most importantly, how would this affect pet parents who rely on clear, accurate labeling to make informed decisions about their pet's nutrition?
Yeah, all really good questions. And we're going to get into all of that today and more with two great guests. I'm pleased to introduce Austin Therrell, Executive Director of the Association for American Feed Control Officials, or AFCO, as well as Dr. Charles Starkey, Vice President of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs for the North American Renderers Association, or NARA. So, to get a little more context about our great guest today, Austin, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks for having us. My name's Austin Therrell. I currently serve as the Executive Director for the Association of American Feed Control Officials. Been in that role for a little over 2 years now, and prior to that, managed the Animal Feed Regulatory Program at the South Carolina Department of Agriculture for about 8 years. So as part of that role, oversaw state inspection program, sampling program with our state laboratory, and we reviewed quite a few, products and labels for marketing claims and that type of thing.
And Dr. Starkey, let's hear a little bit more about your background as well.
I have a degree in animal nutrition and have been in the industry for over 30 years, production and nutrition-based and feed manufacturing. I'm currently the Vice President of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs for the North American Renderers Association, and just working on with our allies at AFIA and other associations on making sure we're manufacturing safe, nutritious food for animals.
Very impressive. Thank you for that. So I think before we get too much into the weeds about the bill, let's set the stage a little and talk about how pet food is currently regulated. Austin, if you could, walk us through what that looks like now. And then we'll get into some of the concerning changes that the PURR Act is proposing to make to this current process.
Absolutely. So, pet food in the United States is regulated on the federal level by the Food and Drug Administration, and then additionally by all the states in the U.S. And so, generally speaking, each state has a commercial feed law and regulations that really dive into the weeds a little bit more than some of the federal laws do. And so, they get into marketing and labeling requirements and so on. And so, it's really what we refer to as an integrated food safety system. So, it's a partnership between those federal and state regulators to oversee all of the animal food. So whether that's pet food or ingredients or livestock feed, all of it's covered by state and federal laws.
It's really nice. It's not always that the regulators and industry get to work this closely together, but in this case, the intent is the same, to make the safest, best food we can for animals.
Ah, got it. Thank you both for that explanation. Now, what exactly is the PURR Act?
Simply stated, the bill is seeking to preempt the state authority over pet food and hand that to the FDA and really federalize the way pet food is regulated and kind of take away a lot of the state authority that currently exists under those state commercial feed laws and pet food regulations. A couple of things I think is helpful, since we're going to be talking about kind of harmonization and uniformity, because I think it's important to point out when we talk about, this patchwork, right? That's where AAFCO fits in, and where as an association, I feel like it's really beneficial for us. We promote a model feed bill and model regulations that really, in some form or fashion, form the foundation of most of the feed laws and regulations across the U.S. And so we kind of come in and serve in that role to promote uniformity as much as possible.
Okay, just a couple pieces of important context here. The FDA has relied on AAFCO to be its boots on the ground in the regulation of pet food products across the United States for the last 17 years. That is, until the FDA opted not to renew a long-standing partnership agreement last fall. You might hear it referred to as the MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding. And if you'd like to learn more about that whole saga, we have an episode for you that we've linked in the show notes, so be sure to check that out if you want to learn more. Now, AAFCO is made up of state-level regulators who have worked super closely with the FDA and done a ton of hands-on regulation work on behalf of the FDA for nearly 2 decades. But under the PURR Act, that partnership will go away. And with it, we would lose the longstanding expertise and experience that our state regulators offer to the system. This is red flag number 1.
I think the job and the working together with AAFCO needs to continue. I think a lot of the industry feels that way. We get into discussions about patchwork and harmonization, and that needs to be done. And everybody agrees that needs to be done. The feed industry, the pet food industry, the regulators themselves, both FDA and AAFCO, we definitely need to work together as a coalition to try to harmonize those standards. And I think there's just a lot of work, together going forward on that. FDA is very shorthanded. And so they've been contracting state officials who know the local feed industry and pet food industry, and they go and do the audits. They're the ones on the ground. They're the ones taking samples. Most often, they are the ones that catch things ahead of time. Mislabeling or a contaminant or a deficiency that comes from a sample that state people on the ground have collected. So I actually have some concern with the dissolving this agreement, because that cooperation between federal and state puts more people on the ground. The industry's goal is to produce safe, nutritious animal food. And we can work with regulators to help us do that. There's always a continuous improvement protocol in place. And that's what those audits just assist us in doing. And so I believe in cooperation and collaboration with the regulators, and having more feet on the ground and more people in the facilities and having more of those conversations helps us all get better. It helps regulators learn about the industry, and it helps us get better at making sure we're doing our job effectively.
Austin, you mentioned the word preempt earlier, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. Essentially, that means under the PURR Act, everything would fall under the purview of the FDA, and the regulatory power that states currently hold when it comes to pet food would be taken away and replaced entirely by federal regulatory authority. Is that correct?
Correct. Basically, their authority over pet food products for dogs and cats specifically would be non-existent if the PURR Act were to be passed. Those inspections that state regulators do throughout the year, at least 70% of all animal food inspections at manufacturing locations across the U.S. are conducted by state regulators under contract with FDA. That doesn't really even account for the non-FDA inspections that states conduct under their own authority. And so, to give you some ballpark numbers, just from last year, states conducted at least 1,000 more inspections solely under state authority than even the FDA. A lot of states have registration requirements for that pre-market review of pet food labels, and so the industry has to register those products before they offer them for sale in the state. Last year, states registered over 171,000 pet food products. Those state laboratories collected over 6,500 samples of pet food products. Again, this is aside from anything under FDA. Those samples, they're testing for proximate analysis, the nutritional testing. They're looking for potential adulterants or contaminants that might be there. States took enforcement action on more than 500 of those samples and followed up on more than 50 different recalls. So that's all state-only work, again, that would completely go away if their authority over pet food products were to disappear with the PURR Act passing. The states are doing a ton of work in regards to consumer protection to make sure that, our pets have the safest, most nutritious food to eat.
I appreciate you sharing those numbers because I think it really puts into perspective just how big of a role state-level regulators have played in this process and actually enforcing regulations to make sure pet food is safe and what is on the label is what is really in the bag. So let's take a step back. Jordan, can you dive a little deeper into the current system? Can you help me understand the current system?
Girl, I was hoping that you could help me understand the current system, but luckily we've got a lot of experts on today's call and we did some research. We did. So yes, let's get into it. So under the current system, we have model regulations that are set by AAFCO, and individual states can choose whether or not they want to adopt them and codify. In other words, integrate those model regulations into actual rules and systems for their state. But when talking about the PURR Act, these regulations would be set at the federal level instead, and then handed off to the states, and state regulators wouldn't have any say about whether they would enact or enforce or codify or not enforce that particular regulation. Austin, is that kind of the gist?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. Right now, within a lot of the state feed laws, some of the federal laws that exist, like the Food Safety Modernization Act, states can adopt by reference and include those within their state laws. And so, then the federal authority is the state authority in those cases, but they can pick and choose that now. In this instance, they wouldn't have that choice. It would be the law of the land.
The law of the land. Got it. So obviously you talk with a lot of state regulators as well as people that work in the pet food industry. And so I'm curious to know what sentiments or rumblings that you've heard from either your fellow regulators or from industry members in conversations about this bill.
Maybe just go back to like a 30,000 foot view of the legislation. From industry standpoint and what I've heard, there are concerns from the industry that, the state-by-state approach to this is cumbersome. It's difficult. Some of the states aren't as aligned. And so they're having to meet requirements in one state versus another. And so I think, again, this is being introduced to try and promote a lot more uniformity than even we have now. It's important to share, too, that, this bill was put together and worked on by industry alone. The state regulators were not consulted in any part of this. A lot of our members would support, one set of federal pet food regulations. It's a lot of the other pieces of it, that I think are detrimental to the safety and the consumer protection pieces of this. But I say the goal, I think, is to really try and harmonize the system and really for the pet food industry, or at least some of them, to get out of a lot of the red tape that honestly they feel like states require, but really is there for, a good reason to make sure that those products are safe and that, the claims that we see on pet food labels are truthful and not misleading.
Just one clarification of what Austin said. A portion of the industry put the PURR Act forward, not the entire animal food ingredient industry.
Yeah, and that's important to note because I think some of the industry is supporting this, or some of the bigger corporations that are out there. And, maybe some of what is being proposed under the PURR Act would be beneficial from them as far as just making things easier. But it's not representative of the entire industry and some of the smaller firms that may not agree with it.
Yeah, and especially when you consider smaller companies typically being more resource constrained already compared to some of the bigger multinational brands. And I think that's really one of the key red flags of this bill. Because as we kind of see it, smaller pet food producers and ingredient companies is where some really, really cool innovation comes from. And it's also interesting to note that while this bill was introduced by 2 Republican and 1 Democratic congressmen, one of the driving forces behind it is the Pet Food Institute, or PFI, whose membership makes up the vast majority of U.S. pet food and treat products, according to their website. We reached out to PFI to invite them on this episode, but never heard back. Now, their members are some of the largest pet food and treat producers in the country and have significant market shares in the industry. So if this is the portion of the industry that worked on the PURR Act, it would make sense that the new regulatory system would benefit these big players, right? But what about the smaller guys? How would they fare against a regulatory system designed for some, but not all? I guess I just worry that we could potentially shortchange some cutting-edge advancements in nutritional science and ingredient technologies that originate with some of these smaller, more agile pet nutrition brands. Like, we all love an underdog. But I could see how this bill could stifle innovation from smaller companies that don't have as much influence in the industry, as well as creating space for bad actors to misguide consumers on ingredients and claims.
It really begs the question of who loses and who wins as a result of this bill.
Right, exactly. So let's use that as a jumping off point. I'd love to hear from you, Austin, and Dr. Starkey about the key concerns you have about the PURR Act, either from an industry perspective or a consumer perspective.
Yeah, some of the pieces that I think from an AFCO perspective that we find a little bit difficult within the bill. Obviously, the preemption language, right, to preempt the state authority. And I'll share a couple other numbers that I think are important. When we look at, whether we're doing this inspection work under a contract with FDA or as a state, right? Like I said, there's an integrated food safety system, so I don't want to disparage FDA in any way. But they're struggling with resources and staffing as well, like a lot of others. There was a Government Accountability Office report that came out where it highlighted that FDA failed to meet inspection frequencies since 2018. When we look at the cost of doing inspections, for FDA to go out and do an inspection is going to cost around $20,000 to go out. And that's just a current good manufacturing inspection. A state inspector could go out and do the same inspection for roughly about $2,000. And so when we look at just the differences on how taxpayer money is being spent and how we can regulate the industry and do it as efficiently as possible with taxpayer dollars, the best model is that shared authority between states and FDA where we can do that together.
So if the PURR Act is passed, I'm curious, could this potentially put some of them out of work?
Yeah, I mean, realistically speaking, it certainly could. When we look at a lot of the work that our state programs do, and we talked about licensing and registration and tonnage fees, and some of those user fee programs are what support the animal food programs at the state level. And so when you take away this authority for states to do that, and they're solely operating under maybe contract as a commission official with the FDA, they're relying on those FDA funds, and that's likely it has the ability to decrease some of the staffing at the state level and cut those funding mechanisms. If states want to, maintain that same level of funding, sometimes maybe it could create a scenario where those, fees are passed off now to the livestock side, who's still going to, exist outside of the PURR Act. And so it's going to increase fees, user fees across the industry.
So increased fees the potential for funds to be reassigned to other segments of the animal food industry that still have some state-level regulatory authority. And then the other side of that is, where is the FDA going to find the time? You know, this stuff is a lot of work, and the FDA is already understaffed and underfunded. And the PURR Act doesn't stipulate any kind of additional funding for these really sweeping changes. How is that even going to work?
Right. It's like giving the FDA more than we know they can handle, no additional funding, while at the same time taking power away from state regulators who have been doing this for years and have really honed their expertise and knowledge about what's important to consumers in their state and how to protect them and their pets. I mean, what could go wrong? And then think about the timing of this is just impeccable. So we're recording this in early 2025, and I'm sure many of us are already aware of the changes to federal agencies across the board being driven by the Trump administration and the new Department of Government Efficiency. We're talking significant budget cuts, sweeping layoffs, and hiring freezes, which could very well impact how pet food is regulated through the FDA's Center for Veterinary Medicine, or CVM, especially if the PURR Act moves forward.
Yeah, and according to some recent reports that I've read, the FDA could lose thousands of employees by the end of the year due to a combination of budget cuts, reforms, and leadership shakeups. And let's be honest, this is happening at a time when public trust in the FDA is already kind of on the rocks. A 2025 survey by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that only 53% of respondents have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the FDA's ability to make the right recommendations on health issues, which is not great.
Not great. And it gets worse. So we're already seeing layoffs hitting key areas of the FDA, including regulators responsible for ensuring that drugs for pets and livestock are safe and effective. According to one report, one FDA CVM employee said at least 20 animal drug reviewers had already lost their jobs. But since this news is spreading through word of mouth and anonymous sources rather than through official channels, the real number could actually be much higher.
That's a serious problem. These layoffs don't just affect pet food safety, they could impact the safety of food products that come from livestock, which means this could have a ripple effect on the human food supply as well.
Yikes. So if the PURR Act moves forward and shifts even more regulatory responsibility to the FDA and the FDA CVM, how exactly is the agency expected to handle this? I mean, as you said earlier, they're already understaffed, underfunded, and struggling to keep up with their existing responsibilities. But adding more to their plate without additional funding or personnel, and even amid, budget cuts and people getting laid off, it just seems like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly, Jordan. We're already seeing the consequences of regulatory gaps. And if the PURR Act removes state oversight while the FDA is losing experienced staff left and right, it raises a major question. Who's left to ensure pet food safety? Because right now, it looks like that answer might be no one.
So that is something. And if you want to learn more about all of that, we've linked some reports that we referenced in the show notes for this episode. But Austin, what else concerns you about this bill? Any other red flags, and specifically red flags for pet parents?
The other issue we find problematic is the ingredient sometimes present language that allows for the substitution of specifically fats or oils. There's some of the flavor ingredients or some of the grain ingredients. And we know that's allowed on the human side. That's where this comes from. And, when I eat something, I know what I'm eating, and I can tell you whether or not, something is in there that I want to be in there. Our animals don't necessarily have that luxury. It's our responsibility to know exactly what we're feeding them. When we're looking at, dogs or cats that might have allergy issues, it's really important for consumers to know what fats or oils are in that product or what flavor ingredients so that they can avoid particular ingredients if they want to. And so we feel like this really, again, it's not ideal from a consumer standpoint, but from an industry standpoint too, it creates a mechanism for potential bad actors to say, hey, we're going to label a product with maybe a fat or an oil ingredient that has a better consumer perception, and then substitute it for something of lesser quality that maybe can increase profit margins. And so, again, not to say anyone would do that, but it creates the opportunity for bad actors to capitalize on that. And I don't think that's a good idea for anyone. The last piece that I'll touch on, I think, is the permissible marketing claims. So, human grade is mentioned, natural is mentioned, and some of those things. Within the current AAFCO official publication, we have guidelines for making some of those claims now that anyone can go and find if you want to read through that publication. What the problem here is that it's codifying that, but at the same time preempting the state authority to check for those marketing claims. So essentially it's saying, hey, we can put this on our package and no one's going to ask us a question about it. Or you don't have the authority to check and make sure it's actually truthful and not misleading. I mentioned earlier that states have those pre-market label review programs in place. And so they have the authority when they see claims to reach back out to a firm and say, hey, can you substantiate that this claim is truthful, not misleading? They can request documents to substantiate that claim, to prove that it's truthful, that it's actually human grade, those type of things. And they do that within that label review process to make sure that by the time that product or a product is on the shelf, that claim is truthful. And so by just codifying that and then not allowing anyone to do any kind of pre-market review to ensure that it's actually, in fact, true, it just opens the door for some of those claims, those buzzwords and those trendy marketing claims to just be slapped on packages with no one verifying that they're actually accurate. So again, that's just from a regulator standpoint, that's problematic. And those are the type of things that state regulators right now are looking at on a daily basis.
Yeah, yikes. I am not loving that. And coming back to your earlier point, our pets can't tell us if there's something wrong with their food. We have to advocate for them. So if companies can fudge their ingredient statements and claims and swap one ingredient for another willy-nilly while the pet parent is none the wiser, that just, to me, goes against the entire industry's mission of keeping pets healthy, happy, and well-fed.
Yeah, Jordan, I like to think about it in human food or what we may experience. Think about people with nut allergies. Let's say someone is allergic to peanuts, but not almonds, and they run out of almond butter in this product, and they just decide to replace it with peanut butter. Or say you love chocolate-covered almonds, and they ran out of almonds, and they just replaced it with peanuts. It's still a nut, and that's the kind of swapping that we're talking about in pet food.
Yeah, it gives the manufacturer the ability to make a swap and not disclose that on the label. I mean, nut allergies are like some of the most common food allergies in the United States. So I like the way that you framed it. Like, people have to be really cognizant of this stuff. And the same can be said of pets that have food allergies or special dietary needs. They need to get what's exactly on the label. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions with this. When we talk specifically about dogs and cats, we have two very different mammalian species. When we talk about substituting fats and oils, you're talking about substituting potentially oilseed oils for animal fats. And there's very little research on this, but there's some that has a high suggestion for cardiac health and other reasons. Animal fats, specifically in a cat, but in other mammals as well, would definitely be more nutritious sources of fatty acids, and especially saturated fatty acids. The other thing is just digestive upset. Many of us have changed pet food at home, and if you don't start to do a blend and do that carefully, we all tend to have nice presents and messy situations to clean up. So the ability to just change that in a specific formula without consumer knowledge, I worry a little bit about how that may affect the pet. The flavor ingredients, that has some impact as well, but the grain ingredients really concern me pretty highly as well. There's very different fiber fractions in these different grains. There's a huge difference in nutrient digestibility and availability of the animal in a grain like corn than there would be in a grain like wheat or barley. And I'm not saying any of those are better or worse, but they have to be formulated extremely differently. And so I think it's more a question that I'm not clear on. Are we talking mass substitution of one grain for another? There's just some questions there because one ingredient is not the same as another, whether we're talking about fats and oils or grains or protein. They can be very, very different. I don't know exactly what may end up happening to the pet there.
I think it's a big deal to point out too, within the PURR Act language, they're calling for a 90-day ingredient review time for new ingredients to support the industry. When we look at like the current, the regulatory systems, the pathways for ingredients to come to market, those, generally had about a 180-day review time. If we look back to around 2019, and I've got some numbers I can share for food additive petitions, FDA was reviewing only about 19% of those on time within that 180-day timeline. For GRAS notices, they were around 29%, and around for AFCO ingredients, it was at 22%. So that was pretty bad. Now, the industry as well as AFCO, during that time period, were advocating and going to Congress for additional support for FDA and those folks within the Division of Animal Food Ingredients that they really needed more staffing and more people to do those. And Congress granted that. They got additional funding and were really able to build that staffing up. Those were 2019 numbers. If we look at last year, the FDA was reviewing 100% of food additive petitions on time, 94% of GRAS notices on time, and before the AFCO MOU ended, they were around 81% on AFCO ingredients. So a significant change, and that bottleneck, in the ingredient space, realistically, it no longer exists right now. Now, we're still talking about a 180-day review time, though. So within the PURR Act, you're calling for to cut that in half to 90 days. Also, there's no appropriations related to this bill as well. So we're saying, hey, FDA, do your work in half the time. We're not going to give you any more funding to hire more staff and to meet those numbers either. So I think it's setting the agency up for failure to kind of set a little bit of an unrealistic goal to do that. And, practically speaking, a lot of these, products are going to go, unregulated in a lot more of a sense than they are right now. And I don't think that's setting, the industry or consumers up for success in the long term.
The other piece of that is the 2025 version of the PURR Act was reintroduced in January, and that version of the bill stipulates additional responsibilities for the director of the Center for Veterinary Medicine, or CVM, which is essentially who would spearhead regulatory activities for pet food if it was all placed under the FDA. Now, these added responsibilities include conducting research to support regulatory decisions, as well as educating industry members and consumers about pet food safety and nutrition. And I'm taking this straight out of the 2025 version of the bill, but Steph, this doesn't add up to me.
Don't even get me started. It's so funny because when we were working with the FDA during the DCM scandal, the FDA told us that they don't conduct research on behalf of the industry. The industry has to do research. So even if the PURR Act was enacted, would the FDA CVM really hold up that part of the bargain?
Yeah, doubtful, right? And if the agency's already constrained from a resource perspective, and now we're giving them loads more responsibility and requiring them to do it in a shorter window of time, I don't see how that's going to set anybody up for success or even set us up for continuity from the current system.
So when you boil this all down, there's a lot to the PURR Act that deserves a second look. And there are certainly more serious ramifications for pet food safety and transparency than what's evident at face value.
I think everybody, industry especially, goal is to reduce recalls, to provide safe, nutritious food. It doesn't do anyone in the industry any good to produce a bad product. So we want to make sure those animals are as healthy as they can be. And they mean a lot to us. So I think everyone's working together. Industry, federal and state are all working together toward that end goal. But we need to always remember how important animal foods, whether they're livestock or pet, are part of the entire safe food system in our country and across the globe. And they're really part of the overall One Health approach. And so I think we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that was well said by Charles. The only other thing, I just want to add on to that is, yeah, we're talking about almost 2/3 of U.S. households that own a pet. They're part of our family. And so, again, I guess to maybe land the plane on this, when we're looking at the PURR Act, there are a lot of things when we talk about uniformity and wanting the best system in place for the industry. We all want the same thing. I want uniformity across the U.S. as much as anyone. As regulators, we want a system that, supports innovation for the industry. And at the end of the day, just like the industry, we want safe food products for animals. And, I think just in regards to the PURR Act, that's not maybe at this point in time the best option for that. I think there's other ways we can work on these issues to be more efficient and all to accomplish the same thing.
Absolutely. So the bill was reintroduced in January. What's next? For pet parents listening and maybe also industry members, how would you suggest they make their voices heard about this issue?
Yeah. We're in the sandbox right now. Anyone listening within the industry or as a consumer or pet owner, right now, just to be aware of what's going on, what your elected officials are signing on to. Keep your eyes open for changes in this bill, opinions and letters that come out from AFCO and from others, so you can stay up to date on what's going on. And certainly, if you feel like anything we've shared today resonates with you, to reach out to those elected officials and just share that, you're not supportive of the PURR Act and would really appreciate some more focus back on the state animal food programs.
Yeah, I think from my viewpoint, overall, if we can continue collaborations with the pet food and the livestock feed and the industry and the regulators, I think we can come up to a lot of solutions to a lot of the problems or the complications that we're dealing with currently. Opportunities, that would be the best word to use.
Right. Yeah. It's obvious that there are several kinks to work out here, and not even to mention some of the issues that are foreseen with the generally recognized as safe or GRAS statute that we talked a little bit about earlier, which is essentially one of the ways a new pet food ingredient can come to market. Or has historically been one of the ways, but recent leadership appointments at the federal level spell an uncertain future for this pathway. Now, while that is definitely implicated with the PURR Act, it's kind of a whole other can of worms. But if you'd like to dig deeper there, let us know, and we'll put together another episode about that piece of the puzzle. Overall, though, it sounds like, as the bill stands today, the intention might be there, but in practice, there are just so many loopholes and contingencies that could end up complicating pet food safety and transparency for pet parents across the United States. So I really appreciate Austin and Dr. Starkey, you sharing your thoughts on this bill and for the candid conversation that we've had today. And I look forward to staying in touch so that we can keep everybody informed about this important issue. The PURR Act presents some significant challenges for both industry professionals and pet parents. Although the goal of harmonizing regulations is understandable, I'm personally not convinced that overburdening an already resource-strapped federal agency like the FDA, stripping state regulators of their local regulatory authority, and potentially weakening oversight of safety and marketing claims is the right approach.
Our commitment at BSM Partners and Barking Mad is to support pet food stakeholders, from industry professionals to loving pet parents, as they navigate the increasingly convoluted regulatory landscape.
For our fellow pet parents, if what you heard on today's episode concerns you about the future of pet food, now is the time to take action. Contact your state representatives and write them a letter to voice your concerns. And if you don't know who your state representative is or how to contact them, we've even made it easy for you. In the show notes for this episode, we've included a link to the U.S. House of Representatives website, where you can input your zip code to find your government officials and how to get in touch with them. We've also linked to a form letter that you can download, add your information to, and send to your elected official to voice your concerns.
We've also provided links in the show notes below to the full text of the PURR Act of 2025 and other related resources to equip you with all the knowledge you need to determine whether this bill is truly the right thing for you and your beloved pets.
We hope you'll leverage these resources and keep up with BSM Partners thought leadership to stay informed about the potential challenges and opportunities posed by the PURR Act. And we encourage you to become part of the conversation by sharing this episode with your friends, fellow pet lovers, and industry members, and engaging in dialogue to ensure pet food remains safe, transparent, and accountable. A huge thank you to Austin Therrell and Dr. Charles Starkey for sharing their insights with us today. We'd also like to thank our dedicated team, Adi Miette Thomas, Neely Bowden, Kate Wright, Katie Wolf, and Dr. Katie Miller. An extra thank you to Leanne Haggerty and Michael Johnson in support of this episode. See you next time.